Has monotheism made us nuts? Hi, this is Michael Shevack. Welcome to Godsearch. You may not know the mystery of life, and you may question what everything is and where it comes from and where do we go, what happens after we die, do we actually die, and all of these questions. And they're not easy to answer, but whether you like it or not, you're on a search for that simply by being alive. And why do it alone? Welcome. Thanks for being here and keeping us company while we all search for the good. The good. Shrink it down. You get the word God, the truth, the unity, and the harmony between our actions and the design, if you don't mind that word, of this world. So what I wanted to talk about in this podcast, because it just came up this morning. I mean, I was talking to my wife, Teddy, about it, and she said, hey, you should podcast that. So I decided to do it while I'm searching, by the way, for other people to interview, because I really did like interviewing, and I thought that was a lot of fun. What I wanted to talk about is the lunacy that the monotheistic tradition, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has accidentally introduced into the world. Now, I'm not saying that what they introduced in the world in monotheism is worthless. I'm not saying it's 100% destructive. It's never either or, okay? Unless you have a certain kind of logic system where, if you're going to be monogamous, you can't cheat. Well, you can vary the different kinds of marriages and get kind of playful as people are doing these days. But if you're going to be monogamous, it's either or. It's a vow. You don't have a choice. It's either one or the other. Aside from things like that, either or is a very dangerous logic function, very primitive kind of Aristotelian thing with excluded middles, it's called. Anyway, I may be sidetracking, but let me get back to it. Monotheism and the exclusivity of monotheism, that there is one God and only one God, is a marvelous thing. It represents the unification of the human perspective. We're no longer seeing all the various forces in nature as if they are separate entities, separate things. We're seeing them as components in a larger unity, which is all around us. This is monotheism in this sense, is the beginning of the scientific viewpoint, because we are looking at reality instead of seeing disparate elements that are at war with each other. We are seeing a unified whole. But the monotheistic perspective, as it's developed, has created a confusion, and a dangerous confusion. We are beginning now in this era, which is postmodern, to deal with it, because from that extreme of the monotheistic perspective, we have engendered extremes of a kind of neo-pagan, a kind of libertine, non-moral tradition. We have gone to extremes of capitalism versus communism. All these things come out of the prophetic, historical, monotheistic perspective. So let's deal with this basically. We've referenced some of this stuff earlier in Godsearch, and a lot of the stuff was there to give you reference points, because without those reference points, further discussions, we can't really have them. So using some of those reference points, there is a very curious distinction between the first chapter and the second chapter of Genesis. In the first chapter, the term that is translated to the word God in English, the King James Version, is a marvelous translation. It still is a really marvelous translation, by the way. That term that's used is Elohim. Now, it's a very curious word. It's a plural word, but yet it takes a singular verb. It's a plural word, but it takes a singular verb. Now, this is a fascinating thing from the standpoint of dealing with God, because what you're stating is that Elohim, which was a general term at one time for the gods, and eventually became a singular noun, right, has in it the different components of the different, gods and goddesses that are part of Elohim. So much so that when, male and female are created in the first chapter of Genesis, the image of both male and female are both very clearly in the image of Elohim, which includes both the male and the female images. And you'll see in the first chapter of Genesis, you have an unfolding of the earthly natural order. Elohim is clearly a God that is linked to the earth, the arising or the evolution of life, and human beings. In fact, there's a sequencing there, which is not merely creation. It is clearly an understanding of evolution and increased complexity as time goes on. You can see it in the first chapter of Genesis. But it takes a singular verb. So it has that marvelous monotheistic perspective, ancient, that these different forces are working together. You do get it in Hinduism, which preceded in its singular view of God. And all of the different gods were all different components or aspects of the one God, which is Brahman. In the second chapter of Genesis, when we're dealing with the individuality of conscience, and we're dealing with choice, and we're dealing with the rise of human mental ascendancy over earthly nature, the rise of agriculture, the rise of technology, the term is not Elohim. The term is Yud-He Vav-He, or it's written out as YHV or WH. I'm being careful here because Orthodox Jews do not pronounce that name. They don't pronounce any name, and that's part of the inheritance, and I'll talk to you about that. But, contemporary scholars are not afraid to say the word Yahweh, recognizing, of course, that they're probably pronouncing it wrong, which is the point of the Orthodox Jews. They're going to pronounce it wrong, and they believe that only the priests in the high temple were able to know the pronunciation correctly. Significant, by the way, not just superstition, significant. So the interesting thing about Yahweh is Yahweh tends clearly to be a male-based God, clearly. Adam is clearly created as an individual, but skewing male. The skewing male, it's an androgynous hermaphroditic soul, if you believe the rabbinic midrash, but it's skewing male because we're talking patriarchy here, and Yahweh is clearly identified with the patriarchy God and in the book of Exodus as well. But Yahweh is not as much a creator of earthly nature as is Elohim. Yahweh, you may know from the book of Exodus, where he's declared the Lord is a man of war, where Yahweh's virtue is extolled as a kind of imperial God, a God for conquest. The rabbinic tradition, though, which created Judaism and which bequeathed a thoughtful philosophical view of monotheism, the rabbinic viewpoint tended to unify these two views. It was an act of genius. Rather than having a God who is merely the creator of earth and nature, and rather than having a God that is the God of human conscience and human dominion over nature, the mind that can do agriculture, the mind that can do metallurgy, the mind that can do, and now explode an atomic bomb. What the rabbis did was they merged them in great devotion and great reverence and use the term, which you'll still hear if you walk into a synagogue these days, and they'll say Adonai, Baruch atah Adonai, if they're praying, because that's a very, very sacred name if they're praying. And if they're not praying, in practice of prayer or in everyday life, they will say Hashem, meaning the name, trying to keep very clear that no human mind can properly and completely enunciate the name of God or know God completely. Because if we could know God completely, we could enunciate the perfect pronunciation, and we would, in fact, be God, which is a boundary line, and quite a severe boundary line, between traditional Jewish thinking and traditional Christian thinking. Though there are always wiggly rooms, there are always traditions where they overlap. Now, the important thing here is that there was a division clearly between a God of nature and a God of human nature, and that's obviously why. We human beings can do things that nature can't. We can shape metal into various forms. As the great, scholar in Israel, Nissim Astalung, has determined, metallurgy is the foundational technology to Hebrew thinking, because we could project our forms into nature. We could project our consciousness and shape metal. And the insight of the pre-Israelite or the early Yahwist was to think that, well, no form that we project into the material is itself the source of the material, and therefore there is a God that is greater than our own ability to shape. Okay. Now, over time, in the ascendancy of the power of monotheistic thinking, which is so incredibly unified, was tested and tested and tested by different people. Many of them had a multiplicity of deities that represented different forces of nature, whether it was the wind or the sun, or whether it was a degenerate force, or whether it was a constructive force, or it could be the force of love. It could be many, many different forces. And the monotheistic perspective, because it was so unified, allowed the force of human awareness and human consciousness to become dominant over these naturalist forces. That's the beginning of a science where we can re-engineer electricity. I mean, in the Hindu pantheon, for example, electricity, if you follow Sri Aurobindo, who's my favorite Hindu philosopher, electricity was a goddess in the Hindu pantheon. And human technology is our ability to control these goddesses, right? To take the gods, let's not be sexist, and mold them according to our will to accomplish our goals, whether the god or goddess was electricity, or whether god or goddess is a radioactive material with a half-life of 1,000 years, meaning it's an eternal being, it's an angelic force. Same kind of question arises. Now, if you realize that monotheism is incredibly important, and the God of monotheism is so incredibly more powerful than any of the tiny little natural forces or natural gods that comprise it, Elohim, well, you run into danger. And the danger is that ultimately you begin to think, especially when you bring into notion what we've discussed in the last podcast, the notion of exclusivity and exceptionalism. Well, once you do that, the God of monotheism becomes exclusive and exceptional. And then you see a very strange thing take place. It may have happened before, but it's very visible in the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is run around 500 to 600 BCE, before the Common Era. And Jeremiah says the other gods are no gods. They're no gods. They're not any gods at all. Now, prior to that, you can still see it, and you can hear it if you go to the synagogues. You'll hear prayers like, Mi kamocha be'elim, Adonai, who are you amongst the gods, which is a recognition that the gods are beings and they have power and that they're real, but it draws a distinction of that the God of monotheism is more comprehensive in the dual meaning of it's a greater understanding, and it also encompasses more. Now, after Jeremiah, you have this incredibly dangerous thing that takes place, where you have an ascendancy of the monotheistic viewpoint and an austere unity under human beings, and the declaration of all of the gods of nature, the ones that weave our soil, the natural forces that open the petal on a flower. You have these things being stripped away of all power. The tendency within the rabbinic tradition is to identify the hand of God, a singular God, Elohim, singularly acting, as itself the force that opens the petal on the flower. What happens is you have a flattening of the dimensionality of creation, the scales of divine forces operating at different levels in creation. You get a destruction of minor or elemental forces in nature. You get a destruction of the tendency towards the female component within nature, because the ascendancy of the technological mind appears first within the male of the species and secondarily within women, because they're very, very busy bearing children and taking care of the important things. After Jeremiah's intrusion and radical assertion of one God to the exclusion and denial of all the other gods, history for humankind was set on its course. God became identified with the cult of the human mind. God became identified through and amplified through a Greco-Roman philosophical and political amalgam to Hebrew thought, became identified with the world global empire that arose out of Greek thinking, Hebrew sacred thought, and Roman law. So you have this kind of world cult of the human mind that is unifying the entire world. It is marginalizing indigenous people. It is trampling on the small forces of nature on the planet. It is denying that there are divine forces at action on all levels of reality. It's denying it. Now, I'm not saying all of these forces are co-equal. I'm not saying there aren't higher forces and lower forces. There are higher truths and there are lower truths. Yeah, as I said once earlier, you can derive Newton's equations from Einstein, but you can't derive Einstein's equations from Newton. Einstein is a higher truth that embodies Newton. Newton's truth formulations do not expand to Einstein. There are higher truths and lower truths. There may be higher beings that comprehend more and lower beings that comprehend less. But the denial that a lower being has no value. That is the kind of theological fascism that became linked to the Western monotheistic viewpoint, and which has caused the dangerous political nightmare that we're dealing with. Oh, it's in disguise. We disguise it in all sorts of ways. But the real issue is the belief that any particular human knowledge of anything can represent exclusively and completely unto itself a total view, a complete view, that any human knowledge can be all knowledge. It's like saying the monotheistic one God can represent all the gods, and that the God that created, let's say, a universe from, let's say, a singularity. I have a problem with that notion, so it's a let's say, is the identical scale and identical relationship that goes on when you try to open the petal on a flower. Or if you have compost that is rotting and turning and generating heat. The scale gets lost. The horrible tendency of monotheism is a kind of exclusivism and a kind of exceptionalism. And that doesn't mean it isn't exclusive, meaning there is only one. And it doesn't mean it isn't exceptional, meaning it has the ability to encompass everything within itself. And therefore, because it is so inclusive, it is exclusive. Take that one in. Because it's so exclusive, it can be the only one that is totally inclusive. Right? But it doesn't mean worthless. It doesn't mean that the monotheistic perspective renders other perspectives worthless, to use Jeremiah's terms. No God, no godly, not possessing knowledge, void of anything that is meaningful. Our entire issue with global warming, our entire issue with gender differences, sexual differences, our entire issue with the right position of women and men together as couples and separately, our entire relationship between our thinking process and what we now call ecology is due to a distortion where the God of monotheism became too identified with the God of human thought, chapter 2 in Genesis, and ceased to be identified with chapter 1. And in fact, the two became merged in Hebrew literature to Hashem or Adonai, and that in its reverence that declared these two different aspects of divine power, the God of creation and the God of human creation, that reverence that viewed them and insisted on calling them Adonai, a singular Lord that includes both the planet, both ecology, all of the creatures on it, and human nature. That Hebrew perspective stood in defiance of the false and radical assertion that God was the God of the Western cult of mind over matter, mind over nature, male over female. By declaring that Elohim and Yahweh would both be considered together a singular Lord, in its own way, Judaism defied the error of its own prophet, Jeremiah. The reverence of the heart came in and mitigated the declaration that no gods were other natural forces, that they were no gods, and that there was only a God beyond the God of the God, and everything else was not a God. And those people who took that extreme idealism to its ultimate, right, had to create another system to bring back scale. Oftentimes it's called Kabbalah, where you see scale of divinity in the Sephirot begin to come back into play because the monotheism had become too abstract and too unified. And the scale to differentiate a divine power into its various natural forces by which reality is woven, that scale had been stripped away, and Kabbalah becomes a mystical technique by re-injecting that scale, right? Now, by the way, go to yourgodsearch.com, for heaven's sakes, continue this, because I keep getting all of these confusions from people out there of every single religion on how this stuff fits together and what the hell happened, okay? So go to yourgodsearch.com. The important thing is that we do not need artificial armchair metaphysics. It's very popular these days because people are trying to put back scale. The fact is, the God of nature, the creator of our universe upon earth, which is our most accessible aspect of it, and the God of the human ability to be dominant over many of those forces, and that God who also makes us dependent upon those forces, yet even though we are dominant over those forces, is a singular God. It is a nature beyond earthly nature. It is a nature beyond human nature. You might call it the ultimate or divine nature. It is the totality of all cosmology. It's the totality of all reality, okay? But it's scaled. It differentiates itself. And if you don't do that, you get into all sorts of problems, and theological problems, which produce moral problems, and moral problems produce legal problems. And before you know it, you have wars. And our wars today, as I said from day one on Godsearch, if there's a conflict, you're dealing with missing knowledge. There are scales to divinity. My personal view is not monotheistic. It's not pantheistic, meaning everything is God. That's a popular, kind of new age balance to the extreme austerity of monotheism, okay? My view is panentheism. Everything is God, within God, and of God. All right? The totality, which we might say that is God, embraces its own scales, its own divisions, if you don't mind that word, and its own aspects. My monotheism is not an abstract unity, an abstract being that you cannot divide in any way. That's a mystical abstraction. It's a rational excess. Whitehead destroyed it, as far as I'm concerned. Alfred North Whitehead decimated the idea, and it's still causing difficulties. It is as dangerous in its own excessive mystical way as Jeremiah was in his early stage prophetic way. Do not austerely separate the God of creation from the God of human beings. Do not austerely create a God that is such a being that is beyond any being we may know, in a way that denies reality the ability to differentiate. There is a mystery here, and it's going to be hard to find, but you're on a God search. So keep searching, but remove from you this core duality that is created by a monotheistic viewpoint that is too excessive, that all it does is justify the arrogance of human power. Bring into play a monotheism that has an intellect and is balanced by a heart in a real body that's connected to a real planet. Then you have what I believe is undeniably the essence of true Hebrew thought, which is the foundation of true Jewish thought, which is the foundation of true Christian thought, which is together the foundation of true Islamic thought, with its own inspiration as well, because each viewpoint brings into the equation something extraordinary. We are talking about the salvation of all humankind. And we're talking about the salvation of all of the different religions that are also helping to save humankind. They too are incomplete and need a little bit of work. So anyway, thanks for being here. Welcome to Godsearch again. Uncover God, discover God, and please recover from very dangerous teachings about God that are revered and so taught, and we are so indoctrinated that we sometimes can't see where the left turn or the right turn went. Okay, be careful, be alert to something bigger than what you're being taught and bigger than your own mind can correct. God bless. This is Mike Shevack. Thanks for being here every Wednesday, about 5:45 a.m. Bye-bye.